So we're looking at the issue of secession, and specifically the history of secession. What is secession and how did it develop in America? And American political thought really has contributed much to this concept. And this has not just happened in America, but happened in several places throughout the world. Now, there's kind of three areas of questioning that we can apply here. Is secession, number one, declaring independence, is that a good idea? Number two, is it for a good cause? Is it right or wrong ethically? And then number three, and I think this is the most important question, despite the first two, do people have a right to secede, to exit the authority of a current government in order to replace it? Do people have a right to declare independence, that they are no longer obligated under the authority of another government, even if that government disagrees with them, and that they may separate themselves in order to govern themselves? And then there's all kinds of complicating factors because secession has been used for bad causes as well. So the historical question gets more complicated. But the definition of secession comes from a Latin word, secedere. We use the soft C in English, so we say secession. But in Latin, the C's are hard, so they're always a hard C sound. But it's any act of withdrawal. Could be the definition of secession, withdrawing from something, or political self-determination, meaning people are no longer under one government that had previously ruled them, and they are able for themselves to determine their politics and their government. And then the concept that people have a right under certain conditions, whatever those conditions are, to exit from an established political authority and govern themselves. I think another simple way to argue or to define secession is declaring independence. If a state wants to declare independence, a province, a city, a county, a country, does it have a right to exit a government it has joined or has previously always existed under? Well, the United States kind of develops this area of thought with the Declaration of Independence, which is pretty much the first example of secession. We're obviously declaring independence. It was the British American colonies declaring themselves to be independent political states, meaning they were their own self-governing countries, not just one United States as one country, but 13 countries, that then declared their separation and independence from Great Britain, which Great Britain, several of the political elites, like the King of Great Britain and the Prime Minister, did not agree with America's right to do that, because the colonies, by definition, belong to Great Britain. Colonies belong to a mother country, but if they declare themselves to be independent states, they now are acting as their own countries and say that they are no longer under the British government. And the British government obviously fought a war to attempt to prevent that from happening. But eventually, the British acquiesced to American independence and accepted it. And finally recognized the independence, not just of what we call the United States, but of each individual of the 13 states, because they were 13 self-governing countries. Now, I say the Declaration of Independence is kind of the first and unique step in that direction. There were other times throughout history where kingdoms have divided and separated and things of that nature, but it was around the 1500s where this developed concept of government as we know it today in the modern nation state, where one government has a monopoly on the use of force within a geographic territory. It's in the 1500s where that type of idea starts to develop. And secession, or declaring independence, is people not moving physically anywhere, but limiting the power of that type of government by saying, we no longer recognize your authority. We are no longer part of your nation. And therefore, your governmental authority no longer extends over us. Now, it's only not all who attempt to do that can be successful. It was seemingly unlikely that the American colonies would be successful in fighting a war against Great Britain. But it did actually work. And the Declaration of Independence is actually a declaration of secession of the colonies from the British Empire. This is why it talks about this separation. It talks about when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. In other words, Jefferson writes this declaration with the imagery as if there's politics that are kind of tying the American colonies and Britain together. But he says that there comes a time where it's necessary to kind of cut the ties that previously connected them. And he says, because of this view of human nature, that all men are created equal, are endowed with their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that since all human beings equally, whether they are in government or not, share those human rights, those negative human rights, then that means that the role of government is simply to protect those rights. However, Jefferson reasoned if government, which is made up of other human beings just like us, if government and those human beings in government start to use their position of power to destroy the rights of others, their life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, rather than protecting them, he argues another right here. In this quote, he says that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to constitute a new government. That's the idea of secession, that Jefferson says that the right of a free people is to attempt to change their government, or if the government no longer suits them, they can abolish it, meaning bring that government to an end and bring in a replacement. Now, you could do this through multiple means, but Jefferson's idea was not to go take over the government of Great Britain, but rather to leave the government of Great Britain so that the 13 colonies could govern themselves as states. And that's why the use of the word state is important. The colonies are called free and independent states, just like the state of Great Britain. The way we would think of it today is, I say, 13 self-governing countries, because we use state in a different way than it's typically used. But in this time, Great Britain is considered a state. France is considered a state. Germany is considered a state. And they're saying there's not just one big country called the United States. There are 13 smaller countries like Virginia, Georgia, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, that are now their own independent sovereign governments. Now, kind of interesting, before the Declaration of Independence, and even after the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of Independence didn't actually do anything. It was just a famous kind of statement. But it was up to the individual states whether or not they would actually exit the Union. I mean, exit the British government's authority. So there had to be multiple declarations of independence. There were even some counties, like this one in Mecklenburg, North Carolina, that they declared independence from Britain over a year before the Declaration of Independence. And they came together as a county. A county is a subdivision of the state. But they came together as a county, and this county denied the authority of the British Parliament over the colonies. They said their government no longer has a right to rule over us. And they invested the provincial Congress, which was their own local government, in New Bern with the authority to rule that county, which basically meant that they had declared independence. So a county in Virginia, in North Carolina, declared independence before the official Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson. So Virginia itself actually declared independence before July 4th, 1776. It was up to the states to declare independence. So Virginia declared independence from Britain before the official Declaration of Independence, because Virginia was the only one with the authority over itself. Thomas Jefferson didn't have any authority over Virginia or over any of the other states just by writing this declaration. His was just the famous statement that was made symbolically on behalf of all 13 colonies. But each state had to decide to exit Great Britain, to secede from Great Britain and declare their own independence. So Virginia actually declared independence on June 29th, 1776, a few days before the famous and now holiday, July 4th, 1776. Now, after the Revolutionary War, when all 13 colonies successfully defended their independence from Great Britain, and Great Britain gave up the fight, there was this area of New York that no longer wished to be part of the state of New York. And today, we know it as the state of Vermont, right next to New York. Vermont used to be part of New York state, but Vermont seceded from New York state. Vermont functioned as a de facto independent state. And de facto just means it was in fact, not in legal recognition, meaning New York did not agree. They said, you are still part of our state. And Vermont said, no, we're not. And they basically acted as if and lived as if they were independent. Vermont issued its own Declaration of Independence, which you can read, and this was done in 1777. Now, the New York governor, George Clinton, asked the Continental Congress for permission to declare war against Vermont in March 2nd, 1784. So Vermont declares independence. The governor of New York wants to fight with Vermont to keep it part of New York. It's kind of ironic, though, because New York had just declared independence from Great Britain, and New York had fought against Great Britain to maintain their independence. Now New York was not going to let Vermont go. On March 6, 1790, New York finally reluctantly agreed to admit Vermont into the Union. Vermont separated itself from New York, became independent, declared itself to be a state, and then in 1790, it joined the United States. And interestingly, Vermont, I believe, is the first state to declare an end to slavery in its constitution. So Vermont accepted the Constitution in 1791. So there are several examples during this time of secession, not just of the United States, but within the United States, and sometimes within states and cities and counties themselves that participate, or at least attempt to participate in